Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History Secrets, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight, we're tucking you into bed with something so revolting, so magnificently disgusting, that it'll make you grateful for every boring office job and lukewarm shower you've ever endured. Because tonight's topic isn't about knights or castles or dragons. No. Tonight, we're exploring something far more terrifying: employment. Specifically, the kind of employment that smells like fermented feet and hopelessness. You see, the Middle Ages were not exactly a golden era of workplace safety or hygiene. Back then, your job options weren't between marketing and freelance graphic design. No, they were between shovel human waste, boil animal guts, or become one of the animal guts. The medieval job market was, shall we say, aromatic. And in this gentle hour-long journey through Europe's stinkiest centuries, we'll meet the brave men and women who shoveled, scraped, boiled, and bled their way through life. All so the rest of us could have nice shoes, fresh leather, or vaguely breathable air. Now, before we begin, do me a favor. If you're listening in bed, roll over, get comfy, and hit that like button, gently, as if you were tapping a rat off your pillow. And subscribe, so you don't miss next week's thrilling episode: Why Medieval Knights Smelled Like Wet Dogs in Armor. Take a deep breath. Actually, don't. We're heading into the world of the gong farmer, the original unsung hero of medieval sanitation, the man who looked into the abyss, and the abyss definitely looked back. Let's set the scene. It's the year 1350. The air is thick with fog, wood smoke, and vague regret. You're fast asleep in your thatched cottage when somewhere in the distance, a man sighs heavily and mutters, "Time to shovel." That man is a gong farmer, and his night is just beginning. The term gong comes from an old word for going. So yes, gong farmer literally means the person who deals with where you go. These were the workers who cleaned out cesspits, deep, dark holes beneath medieval latrines where everything that went and stayed. For years, decades, centuries. When the pit got too full, and by full I mean brimming with the worst stew you can imagine, someone had to climb down there with a bucket and start scooping. That someone was the gong farmer. They worked only at night, because hauling human waste through town during daylight hours was considered a bit of a buzzkill. They'd lower themselves into the pit with a rope, shovel up the thick tar-like sludge, and heave it into buckets. Then, they'd carry it outside the city to dump it in what were politely called lay stalls and impolitely called the end of the world. But for all their suffering, gong farmers were actually well paid. In some cities, they earned more than a carpenter or a stonemason. That's right. The man knee-deep in medieval misery was technically a middle-class professional. Of course, this came with trade-offs, like the fact that no one wanted to talk to you. Ever. Marrying a gong farmer was rare. Sitting next to one at church was heroic. And renting a room above one? That was an early form of exposure therapy. The smell, you see, wasn't something you could wash off. The combination of night air, rotting waste, and pure despair clung to their skin like a haunting. Even their coins reeked, which might be the first historical instance of dirty money. Still, without them, medieval cities would have drowned in their own filth, quite literally. Public health depended on the unseen army of men who shoveled through the worst parts of humanity and kept civilization marginally less unbearable. So tonight, as you lie there drifting between wakefulness and sleep, spare a small, peaceful thought for the gong farmer. He's out there somewhere, humming quietly to himself, shovel in hand, gazing up at the stars above and thinking, maybe one day they'll invent plumbing. Now, gently exhale. The air around you is clean. Your room is fresh. And the only thing you need to shovel tonight is the blanket closer to your chin. Picture yourself walking through a medieval town, cobblestone streets, timber houses, a charming market square filled with laughter and freshly baked bread. Now turn left. That's where the smell hits you. Congratulations, you've found the tannery. Leather was one of the most valuable materials in the Middle Ages. It was used for shoes, belts, armor, book covers, and every other object that could reasonably be made out of something that once moved. But making leather was a process so foul, so creatively disgusting, that the tanners were banished to the far edges of town. Right near the river, because of course it helped to have a place to dump things. A tannery was basically a medieval horror spa. First, animal skins were soaked in water to loosen the hair. Then, workers scraped them with knives until they were smooth. So far, so normal. But then came the secret ingredient. Fermented animal poo and old urine. Yes, you heard that right. The hides were dunked in barrels of rancid liquids to soften them, while the tanners stirred the mixture barefoot, because shoes would just get ruined anyway. Imagine standing knee-deep in what can only be described as death soup, with bits of fur floating around like confetti at a very sad parade. And yet, the tannery worker was a respected tradesman, essential to society. Knights wanted leather armor, monks wanted leather books, and everyone wanted leather shoes. So while everyone else in town was pinching their noses, the tanner was quietly keeping civilization clothed. Of course, they paid a price. Their skin cracked, their lungs filled with fumes, and their clothes, well, let's just say they couldn't sneak up on anyone. You could smell a tanner from 100 paces, maybe 2 on a windy day. Children grew up recognizing that smell before they even learned to read. Dogs refused to follow them home. And marriage prospects? Limited. Unless you found someone who'd lost their sense of smell in a blacksmithing accident. Still, the tanner's hands shaped the world. Every strap of a knight's sword, every saddle, every binding that held a medieval Bible together, passed through their cracked, calloused fingers. They didn't write history, but they gave it a nice leather cover. So if you're ever having a rough day at work, remember, at least you don't come home smelling like decayed cow and self-doubt. Now breathe in, just air, not medieval air, and let's step out of the tannery before your imagination needs a shower. If you thought the tannery was bad, oh dear listener, allow me to introduce you to the fuller. The fuller's job was to clean and thicken woolen cloth, an important step before it could be made into warm, luxurious medieval outfits. Sounds harmless, right? Until you learn that the primary cleaning agent was stale human urine. Yes, people in towns and cities actually saved their pee in jars and sold it to local fullers. There were entire businesses that depended on your bladder. Talk about recycling. The process went something like this. First, the wool was soaked in a large vat of urine and water. Then, barefoot fullers climbed in and began stomping, squishing, and pressing the fabric for hours. They churned it like grape stompers in a wine vat, except instead of producing wine, they produced cleaner socks. The smell was so powerful that neighbors complained from blocks away. But the fullers couldn't escape it. The scent soaked into their clothes, their homes, their dreams. There was probably a permanent yellowish tint to everything they owned. Still, still, this wasn't just random labor. It was skilled work. A good fuller could judge by feel whether a cloth had been perfectly thickened or needed more stomping. They worked to the rhythm of songs, sometimes whistling to keep time. It was a smelly symphony of squelches and sighs. When they were done, they'd rinse the wool, dry it, and send it off to the dyers, who would, of course, immediately dunk it in something equally questionable. But that's another story. In a strange way, the Fullers were the unsung poets of practicality. They took what everyone else discarded, waste, and turned it into something beautiful and useful. It's the ultimate medieval makeover show, from piss to pretty. So as you close your eyes, imagine that gentle, rhythmic sound of soft feet stomping in shallow water. Except don't imagine the smell. Let it fade away into nothing but calm ripples and distant medieval humming. You are safe, you are clean, and your blankets are mercifully dry. Take a deep breath. We're leaving behind the stink of the tanner's yard and the puddles of the fuller's workshop. But don't relax too much, because now we're heading into a place that smells of iron and fear. The medieval barber-surgeon's shop. Before modern medicine, doctors were rare, expensive, and often busy studying astrology instead of, treating people. So if you had a toothache, a fever, or an extra limb that needed removing, your best bet was to head to the local barber. And yes, the same man who trimmed your beard might also remove your spleen. Convenient, if slightly horrifying. The famous red and white barber pole you see today, that's not just decorative. In medieval times, it symbolized the two halves of the barber's trade, red for blood, white for bandages. It was basically a big, swirly, now bleeding customer's welcome sign. Inside, the barber-surgeon's toolkit looked like a cross between a hair salon and a torture chamber. Razors, knives, saws, and a mysterious jar full of leeches. If you complained of dizziness, they'd pop a few of those little vampires on your arm to balance your humors. If you had a headache, they might drill a small hole in your skull to let the bad spirits out. No anesthesia, of course. Just a prayer and a towel to bite. Yet somehow, these men were respected members of society. They performed amputations, pulled teeth, stitched wounds, and occasionally cured things, though often by accident. They'd learned through experience, gossip, and sheer boldness. Imagine sitting in the chair. You've come in for a haircut, but you also mention your shoulder hurts. Next thing you know, you're leaving with a shorter haircut, fewer fingers, and a free jar of ointment made from pig fat and mystery herbs. A true full-service experience. And if you fainted, congratulations, you just became the afternoon's entertainment. People gathered around barber surgeons the way we gather around YouTube fail videos, a little horrified, but unable to look away. So tonight, as your body relaxes and your thoughts begin to slow, remember that somewhere in a dim, candlelit shop centuries ago, a man with shaky hands and no medical license was saying, "Don't worry, I've done this before." And somehow, civilization survived. Now, let's step outside for some fresh medieval air. Ah, yes. The year is 1349. Fresh is a strong word. The streets are quiet. Too quiet. Somewhere, a bell tolls, and in the shadows, a man moves with purpose, carrying a sack, a stick, and the sort of confidence only someone with nothing to lose could have. He is the rat catcher. You could call him the unofficial health inspector of the Middle Ages, except instead of clipboards, he had ferrets. Yes, real ferrets. These nimble little creatures were trained to crawl into walls and chase out rats, who were then clubbed, trapped, or occasionally adopted as emotional support rodents. Rat catchers were half pest control, half public hero, and half insane, which, if you're counting, makes 1.5 people, but that's about right. Their work was dangerous. Rats carried fleas, and fleas carried the bubonic plague, otherwise known as the world's worst rash. A single bite could mean fever, swelling, and a swift goodbye. Still, someone had to do it. Cities overflowed with trash and leftover food. Grain stores attracted swarms of rodents. And since cats weren't always popular, people occasionally thought they were witches' pets. Rats ruled the streets like tiny, furry landlords. So our brave rat catcher prowled the alleys, a silent guardian of public health. He was paid per tail. Yes, literally per tail, which led to some creative accounting. Rumor has it a few enterprising catchers released rats into other neighborhoods just so they could discover them later. The medieval version of job security. Rat catchers had a certain swagger. They knew everyone feared disease, but also feared them. After all, they spent their lives knee-deep in things that squeaked and bit. Their clothes were patched, their hands were scarred, and their pockets occasionally wriggled. At night, when others hid from the plague, they ventured out, whistling softly as they laid traps under moonlight. There's something almost noble about that image. Grimy, brave, and mildly deranged. And when morning came, they'd haul their wriggling trophies to the edge of town, dump them in pits, and start all over again. It wasn't glamorous, but without them, medieval cities might have vanished under a tide of whiskers and fleas. So tonight, as you sink deeper into your pillow, imagine the faint sound of tiny paws scurrying far, far away, chased by the steady footsteps of a man doing humanity's dirtiest work. The night is dark, the streets are silent, and for once, there are no rats left. We've spoken of filth and stink, but now we enter the swamp. It's early morning, mist clinging low to the water, birds calling somewhere in the reeds. And there she is, a leech collector, wading barefoot through the shallows, her skirt gathered high and her expression somewhere between calm and mild regret. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a strange mixture of science, guesswork, and sheer optimism. If you had a fever, they said your humors were unbalanced. Too much blood, perhaps. So what's the cure? Take some out. And for that, they needed leeches, lots of them. Collectors, often women from poor villages, would step into ponds and bogs where leeches thrived. The trick was simple. Let them latch on to your legs. When enough had attached themselves and started to feast, you simply peeled them off and dropped them into a jar. And then, of course, you'd do it all again tomorrow. It's the sort of job that really sucks, literally and spiritually. There was an art to it. The best collectors knew where the fattest leeches lived, how to move slowly enough not to scare them, and how to remove them without tearing the skin. A good day's haul might earn enough to buy bread and ale, the bare minimum to survive. But there was a price beyond the itch and the scars. Repeated exposure often caused infection, fever, and, ironically, blood loss. Imagine explaining that one to your medieval doctor. You're pale and weak? Don't worry, we'll fix that with more leeches. Collectors carried small wooden tubs full of wriggling, glistening worms that could later be sold to apothecaries and barber surgeons. Doctors kept them in jars, ready to apply to the sick, the swollen, and the superstitious. And yet, As strange as it sounds, the leech was one of the few medical tools that sort of worked, for certain conditions at least. They helped reduce swelling, and their saliva even contained mild anticoagulants. So maybe these collectors weren't just harvesting parasites. They were, in their own quiet way, gathering hope. Now close your eyes. Picture that calm, misty pond. The water stills, the leeches sleep, and somewhere, a weary woman hums softly to herself, her jar full, her day done. The world owes her a quiet thank you, and maybe some clean socks. There are dark jobs, and then there are plague jobs. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-1300s, it killed up to half the population. Towns fell silent. Streets were empty, except for the creak of wooden wheels. Those wheels belonged to the plague buriers. They were the men who carried the bodies, the ones who followed behind the death bell and the smell of smoke, armed with carts, shovels, and cloths tied over their faces. Their task was simple and horrifying: collect the dead and bury them before the disease spread further. A race against time, and against death itself. In London, they were called searchers or bearers. They'd walk through neighborhoods at dawn, calling out, "Bring out your dead!" And people did, dragging loved ones to the door, whispering prayers, crossing themselves, and slamming the shutters tight. Each day, the buriers made their rounds, sometimes hauling dozens of bodies at once. The carts groaned under the weight. They dumped the dead into mass graves, pits of pestilence, as chroniclers called them, and covered them with lime to mask the smell. It didn't help much. The buriers were paid well by desperate towns trying to keep order, but most never lived long enough to spend the money. They were the front line of a war no one could win, and yet they kept working. Some out of duty, others out of poverty, and a few, perhaps, because they had grown numb to fear. Imagine the silence after each burial, the brief pause before the next knock on the door. They probably learned not to think too much, not to feel too much. Just dig, cover, move on. There's a strange dignity in that, isn't there? The quiet persistence of someone doing what must be done, even when no one wants to watch. When the plague finally passed, survivors told stories of heroes, doctors, priests, miracle workers. But the buriers were mostly forgotten, and maybe that's fitting. Their job was never about glory. It was about closing the chapter so life could begin again. So as your eyes grow heavy, imagine that the bells have stopped ringing. The air is still. The carts are empty. And for the first time in a long time, the ground rests. If you've ever had a job where your boss made you do all the worst tasks for experience, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the medieval butcher's apprentice. The master butcher was a proud man. He had skill, status, and the sharpest knives in town. But his apprentice? Well, he was the one who did all the things the master didn't want to smell. Picture a small stone shop. Hooks hang from the beams. The floor is slick with, well, you know. There's a pig on the table, a bucket of entrails in the corner, and somewhere beneath it all, a young man wondering if it's too late to become a monk. Apprentices cleaned everything: the blood, the tools, the floor, the walls. They fetched animals from the market, slaughtered them, drained them, and chopped them into neat little pieces. Their days began before dawn and ended when the shop was clean, which in medieval terms meant slightly less horrifying. And yet, it wasn't a job for the faint of heart. Animals were rarely still during the process. Knives slipped, accidents happened. You learned quickly or you lost a finger, which, in fairness, could probably be sold if you didn't mention whose it was. The smell of the butcher's quarter was legendary. Locals knew to keep their windows shut and their prayers short. And although butchers were vital to city life, people still crossed the street to avoid them. It's hard to enjoy your bread when you've just watched a cow become tomorrow's stew. The apprentices rarely earned much money, but they did earn experience and calluses on both hands and soul. Over the years, they'd rise through the ranks, one dismembered chicken at a time, until one day they too would be masters, commanding a new apprentice to mop up what they once had. It's the circle of life, and it smells awful. Still, in a world without refrigeration, butchers were the unsung heroes of dinner. They knew anatomy better than most doctors, precision better than most craftsmen, and humility better than most saints. So as you close your eyes, imagine that faint metallic smell of the shop fading into the distance, the sound of a knife being set down, the sigh of a young apprentice who's finally earned his rest. He wipes his hands, blows out the candle, and leaves behind another day of blood and bone. You, fortunately, can sleep without a single carcass in sight. We humans have always been creative when it comes to labor-saving devices. And in the Middle Ages, when someone said we need more power, they didn't mean electricity, they meant people. Meet the treadmill worker, the original human engine. Before motors or machines, construction sites used enormous wooden wheels that powered cranes and lifts. Someone had to walk inside them to make them spin. That someone was usually a poor laborer, a prisoner, or a man who'd lost a very bad bet. Picture a wheel the size of a small room, with wooden steps along the inside. You step in, start walking, and the mechanism creaks into motion. As you trudge forward, ropes lift massive stones into the air, hoisting them up the sides of cathedrals or castle walls. It's slow, sweaty, and endlessly repetitive. The medieval equivalent of walking up an escalator that never stops. And you couldn't stop. If you tripped or slowed down too much, the wheel might spin backward, sending heavy cargo plummeting, or worse, sending you for a very brief flight. Let's just say medieval workplace safety wasn't exactly a booming industry. The workers inside those wheels developed the stamina of oxen and the existential dread of poets. Hour after hour, step after step, creak after creak. The rhythm must have been hypnotic. Wood, rope, breath, sweat. They say monks chanted in rhythm while building their abbeys. But maybe it was just the treadmill men, keeping the pace. And the pay? Barely enough to buy bread. You worked until your legs gave out. Then someone else climbed in to take your place. A literal cycle of exhaustion. Some even joked that the afterlife would just be another wheel, only steeper. But there's something oddly meditative about it too. Imagine that steady motion, the quiet hum of effort, the distant ringing of church bells. Round and round, the same path, but always moving something greater upward. Without them, those grand cathedrals might never have touched the sky. So tonight, as you breathe in slow and steady, imagine that gentle creaking of the wheel, a sound that once built cities. Step by step, it turns. And like those long-forgotten workers, you too can rest knowing that sometimes even the smallest motion keeps the world turning. We've trudged through muck, waded through filth, and stomped in. Well, let's not think about what we stomped in. Now it's time to stand by the fire. But don't get too close. You're in the lime kiln, And this is where the air burns. Lime was the duct tape of the Middle Ages. It was used in everything. Mortar for stonework, plaster for walls, even for treating animal hides. To make it, you took limestone, heated it in a massive kiln, and hoped you didn't die in the process. Lime burners were the backbone of construction. They worked among roaring fires, choking smoke, and clouds of fine white dust that got everywhere. In their hair, lungs, food, and dreams. Their job was simple. Feed the kiln with stone and fuel, keep it burning hot for days, and then shovel out the finished quicklime. Quicklime, by the way, reacts violently with water and can burn skin. So yes, it was both useful and actively trying to kill you. The kiln glowed day and night, a beacon of progress and lung disease. Villagers avoided the lime yards unless absolutely necessary, because the combination of heat, smoke, and coughing made it look like the gates of hell had opened early. The workers, covered in ash, looked almost ghostly, pale figures moving through smoke, their eyes red, their voices hoarse. They lived short lives, but productive ones. Every castle wall, every chapel arch, every plastered ceiling owed its existence to the men who coughed it into being. And for all their hardship, they earned little glory. No songs were written for lime burners, no ballads sung by the fire, just the steady rhythm of shovels scraping, fires crackling and breathing, heavy, rough, and mortal. So, as you breathe deeply now, safely, cleanly, imagine that faint scent of wood smoke fading, the fires dim, the air clears, and somewhere in the distance, a lime burner lays down his shovel, wipes the dust from his brow, and disappears quietly into the fog he created. And now, dear listener, we reach the most infamous profession of all, the one with the best pay, the worst reputation, and probably the highest turnover rate, the executioner. Every medieval town had one, whether they liked it or not. He was part butcher, part performer, and part therapist for the justice system. When someone needed hanging, beheading, branding, or quartering, this was the man to call. Though perhaps not for small talk, executioners were both feared and necessary. They upheld the law, but lived on the edge of society, literally. Their homes were often built outside the town gates, next to the gallows, where property values were unsurprisingly low. No one wanted to be their neighbor, unless you enjoyed waking up to the sound of sharpening steel. It was a lonely life. You couldn't eat with other townsfolk, couldn't sit too close in church, and definitely couldn't date easily. Occupation? It's complicated. Yet paradoxically, executioners were sometimes local celebrities. A skilled headsman could make a clean cut in a single stroke, earning cheers from the crowd, who loved a good performance. Others weren't so lucky. Botched executions were common, and there's nothing quite like failing publicly at your one job, especially when your audience throws cabbages. Despite their grim task, many executioners were surprisingly meticulous. They kept careful records, maintained their blades, and even provided medical services, since they knew anatomy rather well. Some doubled as surgeons, treating wounds by day and creating them by night. A true work-life balance. But their curse was isolation. They handled death so often that life, for them, became something observed rather than lived. Children crossed the street to avoid them. Priests gave them shortened confessions. Even their dogs were probably nervous. And yet, someone had to do it. Someone had to bear the burden of justice. So they sharpened their axes, tied their masks, and did what others couldn't bear to watch. Now, as you settle deeper into your pillow, Imagine the town square empty and silent after a long day's crowd. The scaffold stands still, the blade gleams in the moonlight, and the executioner walks home, alone, calm, and weary. He hangs up his hood, pours himself a quiet drink, and thinks, at least tomorrow, no one's on the list. We're leaving behind the gallows and walking into something holier, though not necessarily cleaner. Welcome to the monastery. Soft candlelight, whispered prayers, and in the corner, a table full of bones. Because tonight's worker is the relic cleaner, caretaker of the physical remains of saints, martyrs, and the occasionally mislabeled femur. Relics were the superstar collectibles of medieval Christianity. If your church had a saint's fingerbone, a piece of robe, or even a suspiciously generic skull fragment, pilgrims would travel for miles just to see it. They'd pray, donate, and leave feeling spiritually enriched, or at least mildly impressed. But with great holiness came great maintenance. Someone had to keep those relics clean, polished, and organized. Dust doesn't discriminate between saints and sinners. That was the relic cleaner's job. Part custodian, part archaeologist, part forensic mystery solver. They spent their days gently wiping bone fragments, replacing wrappings, and checking labels to make sure the arm of St. Lawrence hadn't been mixed up with possibly a chicken. Sometimes, relics were stored in ornate glass cases. Other times, they were tucked into gilded boxes or sewn into the altars themselves. A careless sneeze could lead to eternal embarrassment. Imagine explaining to the abbot that you just dropped St. Benedict's pinky toe. The work wasn't glamorous, but it carried a strange serenity. Each relic represented faith, sacrifice, and a small piece of history that refused to rot away completely. The cleaners treated their work like a prayer in motion. Quiet, repetitive, and oddly comforting. Still, there must have been moments of doubt. Did they ever look down at a bone and wonder whose it really was? Did they ever mix up saints and poultry? Did they ever feel the faintest itch to sneeze during Vespers? Probably yes to all three. So as you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the sound of soft cloth brushing against ancient ivory. Candles flicker, shadows stretch across the stone floor, and a monk sighs contentedly. One more relic spotless, one more soul honored. The bones rest easy, and soon so will you. Now, let's leave the monastery and wander down to the village, where holiness takes the form of hops. Welcome to the world of the alewife. In the Middle Ages, before breweries, pubs, or even proper plumbing, women brewed beer at home. They made small batches in their kitchens and sold the foamy results to travelers, farmers, and neighbors. Their title, alewife, might sound charming, but their work was anything but easy. They woke before dawn to fetch water, gather herbs, and stir giant cauldrons of bubbling malt. The air was thick with steam, yeast, and the unmistakable scent of ambition mixed with mild panic. If the batch fermented well, they made a tidy profit. If it went bad, they'd be the talk of the village for all the wrong reasons. People took their beer seriously. It wasn't just a beverage. It was hydration, calories, and courage in liquid form. Water wasn't always safe to drink, but ale, boiled and fermented, kept people alive. So in many ways, alewives were community heroes, even if their kitchens smelled like a warm loaf that had given up on life. They were also early entrepreneurs. Some marked their homes with small broomsticks hung above the door, a sign that ale was for sale. Later, superstition twisted that symbol into the witch's broom. So yes, medieval marketing eventually invented Halloween. It wasn't all froth and fun, though. Inspectors sometimes tested their beer by pouring it on a bench and sitting down. If your pants stuck after a few minutes, congratulations. Your ale was strong enough. Medieval science at its finest. Despite the hard labor and endless stirring, alewives held an important social role. Their homes were gathering places, the medieval version of a cozy cafe, minus the Wi-Fi and plus a lot more shouting. There, gossip flowed faster than the beer, and fortunes rose and fell with every batch. As evening fell, the alewife would stand in her doorway, hands on hips, watching satisfied villagers stumble home. She'd smile, wipe her brow, and mutter, "Not bad for pond water and patience." And with that, the village would sleep, warm, merry, and slightly tilted. So as your mind drifts, imagine the quiet fizz of brewing bubbles, the hum of distant laughter, and the scent of bread and barley in the night air. It's peace in pint form. The churchyard is quiet tonight. A soft mist curls around the tombstones, and the moon glints off damp grass. In the distance, the steady thunk of a shovel breaking earth marks the rhythm of another long night. That's where you'll find the gravedigger, and beside him, his assistant. Becoming a master gravedigger wasn't something you could just apply for. It was a trade learned by doing. And doing, in this case, meant digging for hours, days, sometimes through frozen soil or under pouring rain. The gravedigger's apprentice was the one who did the grunt work, cutting through roots, moving piles of dirt, and trying not to think too hard about what or who they might uncover. It wasn't just digging, either. There was an art to it. Graves had to be the right depth, the right distance from others, and preferably free from unpleasant surprises. And when surprises did occur, well, that's what the apprentice was for. "Go on, lad. Move that bone aside," said the master, sipping ale and pretending not to shiver. The pay was low, the smell was constant, and the hours were flexible. You worked when people died, which was, in the Middle Ages, quite often. But the job came with perks: peace, solitude, and a kind of grim job security. After all, business was always steady. Some apprentices found comfort in the stillness of it all. The cemetery was a quiet place. No bosses yelling, no neighbors arguing, just the sound of wind and soil. Others, however, couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching from beneath the ground. A little superstition was normal. Whistling was discouraged. It was said to summon spirits. So they dug in silence. The only sound, the scrape of shovels and the slow exhale of foggy breath. By candlelight, the apprentice learned where to place flowers, how to carve crosses, and how to dig with dignity. When the bell rang for a burial, they'd step back, wipe the mud from their hands, and bow their heads in respect. Then, when the mourners left, they'd fill the grave again, layer by layer, the living serving the dead. So as you rest tonight, picture that quiet churchyard, peaceful, eternal, and soft beneath the moonlight. The apprentice leans on his shovel, listening to the crickets, and for once, there's nothing more to do. Just stillness and sleep. And now, for something a little wetter. Welcome to the medieval public bathhouse, a place of relaxation, gossip, and the occasional skin infection. Your friendly bath attendant will be with you shortly. Bathhouses were surprisingly popular in the Middle Ages. People bathed far more often than the myths suggest, though the experience was, shall we say, different from today's spa. Imagine a warm wooden room filled with steam, chatter, candles, and tubs big enough for 5 strangers and 1 confused chicken. That was a good evening out. Bath attendants were the unsung heroes of this humid chaos. Their job? Keep the water hot, refill the tubs, scrub the floors, and occasionally scrub the customers. They hauled endless buckets from the hearth, managed fires, and tried not to inhale too much of the mixed aromas of herbs, sweat, and whatever someone dropped in the water. In theory, these baths were for cleanliness. In practice, they were part wellness center, part dating scene, part medieval health hazard. You could get a massage, enjoy a drink, chat about local gossip, and, if unlucky, catch something you didn't have when you came in. The bath attendant saw it all. Arguments over soap, drunken, nights singing off-key, couples pretending not to be together. And through it all, they kept smiling. Because in a world without deodorant, this was as close to heaven as most people got. Their biggest challenge? The water. You couldn't just drain and refill a tub for every customer. That would be wasteful. So instead, attendants refreshed the water by adding herbs, oils, and maybe a polite prayer. The first guests got rose petals. The last ones got community broth. Still, there was something comforting about it. The warmth, the laughter, the sense of humanity washing itself clean, if only briefly. The attendants worked long hours, but the atmosphere was cheerful, if slightly unhygienic. Steam clouded judgment, and everyone left smelling like lavender and mild regret. So tonight, as your room cools and your eyes grow heavy, imagine that soft, steamy haze of the medieval bathhouse, the sound of splashing water, the faint scent of rosemary and smoke, and a tired bath attendant wiping down the benches, whispering, "One more tub done. One more night survived." The city sleeps. The fires in the hearths burn low. The dogs curl beneath tables, and the streets are silent. Almost. Because somewhere out there, wrapped in a cloak, holding a lantern that barely works, the night watchman is making his rounds. He's not glamorous. His armor is dented, his feet are cold, and his salary is roughly equivalent to 2 loaves and a complaint. But he walks anyway, through alleys, past taverns, along the city walls, whispering to himself, just to break the silence. "Past midnight, and all's well," he calls out, because that's his job, to make sure everyone knows that nothing's happening. It's a strange profession, to be paid to confirm that the world is still boring. But boring could turn dangerous in a heartbeat. A flicker of firelight could mean a house ablaze. A creak of wood could mean a thief. A sneeze behind a barrel could mean, probably a cat. Or if you were unlucky, a cat-shaped thief. The watchman's tools were simple: a staff, a lantern, and the ability to look brave when you were absolutely not. He didn't have backup. There were no walkie-talkies, no whistles loud enough to wake the dead, though in some towns, that was exactly what he feared doing. His biggest enemy wasn't crime. It was boredom. The kind that seeps into your bones until you start talking to doorways just for company. He'd hum to himself, recite prayers, count steps, anything to stay awake. And sometimes, when the moon was bright and the streets were empty, he'd stop and look up. The same stars every night. The same city. The same endless watch. He'd hear snoring behind closed shutters, smell bread baking in the early hours, and feel oddly proud. Because while everyone else slept, he kept the world from falling apart. So tonight, as your breathing slows and your mind drifts, imagine the echo of those soft footsteps fading into the distance. The lantern light sways, the fog rolls in, and the night watchman whispers one last time, "All's well." And it is. Let's step into another workshop, one that glows softly and smells faintly of smoke and something less pleasant. This is the domain of the chandler, the candle maker. The man, or often woman, who kept the medieval world from stumbling in the dark, one lump of melted animal fat at a time. Before electricity, candles were life. They lit homes, churches, and taverns. They guided midwives and monks alike. But making them wasn't as romantic as it sounds. In fact, it was downright gross. You see, candles were made from two main ingredients, beeswax and tallow. Beeswax was lovely, golden, fragrant, expensive. Tallow, on the other hand, was animal fat, usually from cows or sheep. It had to be boiled, strained, and poured into molds. Imagine simmering an entire barnyard until it turned into light. The smell was legendary. Whole neighborhoods knew when a chandler was at work. The air filled with the scent of scorched fat, smoke, and ambition. People complained, but they also bought candles, because darkness wasn't negotiable. Candle makers had to work quickly. If the tallow cooled too fast, it congealed into lumpy disasters. If it was too hot, it smoked. So they stirred and dipped with the precision of chemists and the patience of saints. Some dipped wicks hundreds of times, layer after layer, building up each candle like a pale, flickering tower. And yet, there was beauty in it. That moment when the wick first caught flame, transforming all that stink and effort into soft, golden light. A tiny miracle repeated thousands of times across every town and village. At night, chandlers often worked by their own creations, surrounded by flickering shadows that danced on the walls. Maybe they wondered if the light was worth the labor, if people ever thought about who made it possible. Probably not. But they kept going anyway. So as your room darkens, imagine that soft, steady glow of candlelight. A flame trembling in the still air, casting warmth across stone walls and tired faces. And somewhere, a candlemaker wipes their hands, sighs, and whispers, "Another day's light. Done." If the Middle Ages had a motto, it might have been, "Dig a hole and hope for the best." Every castle moat, city drain, and muddy trench started with one essential person, the ditch digger. It wasn't glamorous work. In fact, it wasn't even visible work most of the time, since the moment a ditch was finished, it immediately filled with mud, water, and regret. But without these workers, medieval towns would have been flooded, armies stranded, and farmers hopelessly soggy. A ditch digger's toolkit was simple: a spade, a bucket, and a back that hurt constantly. They worked from sunrise to sunset, covered in clay and sweat, carving narrow channels through the landscape. Sometimes for roads, sometimes for crops, and sometimes for reasons no one fully explained. Because the Lord said so was usually good enough. They were the invisible infrastructure team of the Middle Ages. Need a moat around your fortress? Diggers. Need drainage for your fields? Diggers. Need somewhere to dump everything else. Also diggers. Their pay was meager, their clothes were rags, and their feet were permanently damp. But their skill was vital. A poorly dug trench could collapse, flood, or send sewage back into the village square. A medieval nightmare nobody wanted to relive. So they worked with care, measuring by eye, trusting their instincts, and muttering the occasional prayer to Saint Eligius, the patron of manual laborers. The job aged people quickly. By 30, many ditch diggers looked 60. Their shoulders stooped, Their hands thickened, and their lungs filled with the smell of wet earth. But they carried on, because the world depended on people who didn't mind getting dirty. And when the rain poured down and everyone else ran for cover, the ditch diggers smiled faintly. They'd already been soaked for days. This was just another form of baptism, muddy, honest, and humbling. So as you sink deeper into your bed tonight, picture that steady rhythm of spade to soil. Thunk, lift, toss. A heartbeat of progress beneath gray skies. The ditch fills, the rain falls, and the digger wipes his brow, whispering, "It'll hold." And somehow, it always did. Take a deep breath and imagine the air getting thinner, colder, darker. Now you're in the mine. The medieval miner worked in the belly of the earth, carving tunnels by candlelight with nothing but a hammer, a chisel, and alarming optimism. They searched for iron, silver, coal, and salt, the treasures that built kingdoms, fed armies, and occasionally exploded without warning. The work was endless and dangerous. Caves collapsed, fumes suffocated, water flooded the shafts without notice, and the light, their tiny candles wedged into cracks in the stone, barely fought back the darkness. If your flame went out, you waited, you listened, you prayed you weren't alone. Some mines went hundreds of meters deep. Men and boys crawled through narrow tunnels, swinging tools until their arms trembled. The sound echoed like thunder, metal striking rock, mixed with coughing and the distant drip of unseen water. It was claustrophobia with a paycheck. They worked by feel as much as sight. Hands tracing cracks, feet finding footholds. The dust coated everything. Hair, skin, lungs, all turned gray with the earth's breath. Many miners died young, but those who survived grew as strong and quiet as the stone around them. And yet, there was pride in the job. They were feeding the forges that armed knights and built cathedrals. Their sweat became the coins that passed through the hands of kings. No one sang songs about them, but every song that echoed in a hall owed something to their toil below. When a shift ended, they climbed back to the surface, blinking against the sun like men reborn. The air felt too sharp, too bright, too alive. They'd wash in cold water, eat in silence, and fall asleep before their bread cooled. It's strange, isn't it? How much of civilization rested on people who rarely saw the sky. So as you lie in your bed, imagine that distant world below your feet. Tunnels humming with echoes of pickaxes, the smell of damp stone, and faint flickers of candlelight that refuse to die. A reminder that even in the deepest dark, someone was always working to bring light above. Let's step quietly into the apothecary's shop. The shelves are lined with jars, powders, roots, strange liquids, and at least one jar that's moving when it shouldn't be. The air smells like herbs, smoke, and mild confusion. This is where our next worker lives, the pestle pounder. Before modern medicine, apothecaries made their own remedies. They ground, mixed, and brewed every potion by hand. But someone had to do the grinding, and that someone was usually an apprentice with aching wrists and a 1,000-yard stare. The pestle pounder's day began early. Their task? Crush ingredients into powder. Every single one. Cinnamon, sulfur, mercury, mint, snail shells, opium. It was like running a pharmacy and a witch's kitchen at the same time. The work was loud and repetitive, stone against stone, hour after hour. Pound, stir, sniff, sneeze. Their arms grew strong, their patience short, and their sinuses permanently destroyed. A sneeze in the wrong direction could send a week's work, and possibly some arsenic, right into the air. It was a delicate balance between science and survival. Apothecaries didn't always know what their medicines did, but they were confident they did something. And that something was often enough to keep customers coming back, or not, depending on dosage. Some of the ingredients were ghastly. Ground mummies from Egypt, dried frogs, crushed gemstones. If it existed, someone had tried to cure a cough with it. The pestle pounder's job was to make it small enough to swallow and hope the human body didn't file a complaint. Still, it wasn't a bad position for the time. It was clean, mostly indoors, and came with the faint glamour of being near medical people. And who knows, maybe after years of pounding, you'd finally get promoted to mixing or, heaven forbid, diagnosing. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine the quiet rhythm of stone on stone, the gentle grind of crushed herbs, the whisper of dust in candlelight, a small world of smells, powders, and whispered hopes, all turning slowly into healing, or at least an interesting smell. And now, let's climb upward, literally, into the chimneys of the medieval city. It's dark, it's narrow, and the walls are slick with soot. Welcome to the job of the chimney sweep. In an age of constant fires and little ventilation, chimneys clogged fast. Someone had to clean them, and that someone was often a child, small enough to fit inside, unlucky enough to say yes. Picture a boy no older than 8, barefoot with a brush tied to his back and a rope around his waist. He's shoved up the chimney, coughing before he even begins. His job? Scrape away the soot with his hands and feet, wriggle upward, and somehow not get stuck. If he did get stuck, the master sweep would light a small fire beneath him to encourage progress. Motivational flames, you might say. The soot clung to everything: skin, hair, lungs, soul. After a day's work, sweeps looked like ghosts drawn in charcoal. They coughed constantly, wheezed in their sleep, and smelled faintly of burned despair. But they kept the fires burning safely for everyone else. And yet, these children found ways to laugh. They raced each other through chimneys, invented songs, and proudly wore their soot like medals. They were poor, filthy, and exhausted, but they were also alive. And in the darkest flues, where no one else dared go, they became the city's tiny heroes of warmth. Sometimes towns would celebrate them once a year, giving them coins or sweets for keeping the hearths clear. Those were good days. The rest were long, black, and full of smoke. As evening fell, they'd trudge home, eyes stinging, faces hidden beneath layers of soot. Mothers would wipe them clean as best they could, though no one ever got fully clean again. So as you drift toward sleep, imagine that faint crackle of a fireplace. The air smells of wood and comfort, not soot. Somewhere a chimney sweep curls up by the hearth they made safe, dreaming of skies that don't need climbing. And for once, the air is still and warm. The sun hasn't risen yet, but the docks are already alive. Waves slap against wooden hulls, gulls scream overhead, and barrels creak as they're dragged onto the shore. This is where the fishmongers work, the brave, unglamorous middlemen between the sea and your dinner table. You might imagine fishmongers as cheerful merchants shouting prices over the noise of the market. And you'd be right, if you also imagine them permanently smelling like regret and herring. The job began before dawn. Fishermen brought in their catch, and the mongers sorted, gutted, and cleaned each slippery prize. They worked fast, wielding knives with the skill of surgeons and the posture of people who gave up on comfort long ago. Fish had to be sold the same day. No refrigeration, no ice, no mercy. Just the race against time and temperature. The smell, of course, was legendary. Fresh fish could turn foul in hours, especially in summer. So the fishmongers sprinkled salt, prayed for a breeze, and hoped their customers had bad sinuses. They worked surrounded by scales, bones, and puddles of brine that seeped into every pore and piece of clothing. Soap helped, but only emotionally. Despite it all, fish was big business. On religious fast days, when meat was forbidden, everyone turned to fish. Salted cod, smoked herring, pickled eels. And when there's money to be made, there's always someone willing to hold their nose. Fishmongers had their own guilds, their own markets, and occasionally their own riots when prices got too high. They were part tradesmen, part survivalists, and part smell-based deterrent against personal space. Even so, there was pride in their work. They fed cities, kept sailors employed, and brought a bit of the sea to towns that had never seen a wave. And at the end of the day, when the last barrel was empty, they'd rinse their hands in the river, sigh, and head home, followed faithfully by every cat in town. So as you close your eyes, imagine the sound of the harbor, the splash of water, the cry of gulls, the soft rhythm of waves. The day fades, the smell, mercifully, doesn't reach you, and the fishmonger hangs up his apron with quiet dignity. The market sleeps, and soon, so will you. Before smartphones, before newspapers, before anyone had time to invent Do Not Disturb mode, there was the town crier. Imagine a man standing in the town square, wearing a heavy cloak, holding a bell in one hand and a rolled-up scroll in the other. He takes a deep breath, rings the bell, and shouts into the cold morning air, "Hear ye! Hear ye! Another tax you'll all hate has just been approved." That was the job, to be the walking, yelling internet of the Middle Ages. Town criers announced everything: royal decrees, new laws, lost dogs, public punishments, and the occasional wedding. If something happened, they shouted it, loudly. They were hired by the crown, the mayor, or anyone rich enough to afford a human megaphone. But being a crier wasn't easy. You needed a powerful voice, good memory, thick skin, and a high tolerance for flying vegetables. Not everyone liked the news, especially when it involved new taxes, conscriptions, or executions scheduled inconveniently near lunchtime. Still, criers were trusted. In a world where most people couldn't read, they were the living link between the rulers and the ruled. They'd travel from market to market, ringing their bells, reciting the same message again and again until their throats went dry. It wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable work, and occasionally, people even listened. They became familiar faces in every town. Kids followed them around. Merchants stopped to gossip, and the elderly shouted corrections at them just to feel useful. And when the announcements were done, the crier would roll up the parchment, take a long drink of ale, and sigh the universal sigh of anyone who's ever had to repeat themselves at work. There's something comforting about that image, isn't there? A single voice echoing through cobblestone streets, carrying news, laughter, and the faint sound of someone muttering, "Not again." So as you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine that distant ring of a bell, the steady tone of a tired voice fading with the evening air. No alerts, no messages, no pings, just silence. Because for tonight, the town has heard enough. And now, dear listener, as the last candle burns low and the fire fades to quiet embers, we've reached the end of our little midnight journey. Through the muck, the madness, and the magnificent unpleasantness of the Middle Ages. We've met the gong farmers who shoveled the worst of humanity, the tanners who waded through animal nightmares, the rat catchers who fought the plague with ferrets, and the chimney sweeps who quite literally climbed into darkness and came out coughing. We've seen men digging moats, women brewing beer, and monks polishing saintly bones that may or may not have belonged to chickens. We've smelled every stink, heard every scrape, and imagined more bodily fluids than anyone should before bedtime. And somehow, it's peaceful. Because beneath all the grime and absurdity, these people kept the world turning. They built, cleaned, buried, burned, brewed, stitched, and shouted their way through history. Not for fame, not for glory. Just to make life a little less unbearable for everyone else. The Middle Ages were dark, yes, but only because the light came from candles made of tallow, held by hands cracked from labor, carried by people who never got credit, never got statues, and never got to wash off the smell of their own survival. And yet, they endured. The gong farmer in his pit, the miner in his tunnel, the ale wife stirring her bubbling cauldron of beer. Each of them, in their own small way, lit a spark that carried humanity forward. So tonight, as you lie still in your bed, with your clean sheets, your quiet room, and not a single rat in sight, take a deep breath. Let the world fade. And thank those forgotten souls who did all the dirty work so that you never had to. Because sometimes, the grossest jobs build the cleanest futures, and sometimes, the most unpleasant history makes for the sweetest dreams. Now close your eyes. The medieval city is asleep. The fires are out. The smell is finally gone. And all's well. Good night.